Hello and welcome to Take Me Home, the podcast offering a social democratic alternative for the politically homeless. I'm Hilary Salt.
And I'm Sebastian Moore.
And today we are joined by Claire Fox, Baroness Fox of Buckley, the director of the Academy of Ideas, who run the fantastic annual Battle of Ideas Festival. Welcome, Claire.
It's lovely to be with you.
Sort of needless to say, you're our first Baroness on the podcast.
You are.
Well, it's not needless to say that because there's so many baronesses these days. Every time I look, they're making more people peers. So
yes,
I'm sure I'm the first of many.
We'll work on that. I'm the first person from Buckley, I think.
Well, that's much more significant. I think.
Although one of our members in the Northwest is from Buckley. I won't name him, but he is. So.
Very good.
So, Claire, we're really thrilled that you could join us, and we want to talk to you a little bit about the House of Lords and perhaps about the whole process of lawmaking. But shall we just start off by asking you the kind of obvious question, really, of what was it like to be invited to be a member of the House of Lords?
I think, well, it was the surreal for me, and I think that maybe for viewers, listeners, it's worth noting that I absolutely love my job as the director of the Academy of Ideas, and I have never had any interest in being a politician in that formal sense. I've been involved in politics all my adult life, but grassroots, rank and file, Academy of Ideas style work, putting on public events, campaigning, trade unionism, all sorts of things. But what I'd never, ever, ever aspired to be was in a parliament. So the first thing that was weird was that I'd stood as a Brexit Party candidate in 2019. And I was very reluctant to do that when I was first asked by the Brexit Party, by Richard Tyson, Nigel Farage. I said, absolutely no way. I on the one hand, I didn't feel politically at home with that tradition, but I also just didn't want to be in a European Parliament, just didn't want to do it. But I emphasise that point because I then got persuaded, not by them, but by circumstances, that unless we fought for Brexit, it was going to be sold out. And eventually I thought, well, I've got to put my money where my mouth is, and I stood. And so I spent 7 months as an elected politician in the European Parliament, a parliament I wanted to abolish and still do want to abolish, but certainly wanted us to get out of as the UK because we'd voted for it. At the end of my time there, I got a phone call, which I assumed was somebody, doing one of those setups for the radio saying, we'd like to offer you hello, it's somebody here from number 10, some nameless person. I never to this minute know who it was, just didn't catch the name. We'd like to offer you a peerage. And the most significant things were that they said, we know that you want to abolish the House of Lords. That's fine with us. We know you'll say no, but we want you to listen. And then they gave me reasons why I should do it. And I said, no, this is ridiculous and all the rest of it. And then they said, you've got 2 weeks to decide.
Blimey.
And I decided to do it.
I'm so pleased you did.
It was more because I felt as though a lot of people had put a lot of trust in me as the Brexit Party MEP for the Northwest, and whereas I wanted to go back to being the Academy of Ideas, they didn't want that. They wanted somehow it to continue in some way, and I felt, therefore, despite my reservations about the anti-democratic nature of the House of Lords, that maybe I could use it as a platform for those voters, let alone the issues around free speech, which I'm passionate about in relation to the Academy of Ideas.
So for somebody that didn't want to ever be a parliamentarian, you found yourself being a member of the European Parliament and now a member of the House of Lords, both bodies that you want to abolish.
Yes, exactly. Irony. But of course, it's very different being in a UK institution, because maybe I thought, and I confess to you, and I don't often admit this, that I thought, oh, I'll go in the House of Lords and I'll make these speeches and I'll use it as a platform. but I don't think I really understood what the House of Lords did. I associated it with being anti-democratic and blocking, for example, the Brexit vote. I associated it with the great and the good, unelected. Who the hell do they think they are? But I didn't really know what the job was. And I was shocked because I've never thought about how laws are made. And even though I was arguing when I was a Brexiteer that lawmaking had to be brought home to the UK, I then realized that, oh my God, now I'm a lawmaker. And I realized that possibly I should not be quite as glib about it as I had been, that actually now I had to take some responsibility for the laws that are made in this country, because I had this role as a legislator. And it was a very steep learning curve. And even now it still is, because actually lawmaking is very complicated and not as democratic as one would want it to be by any stretch of the imagination. But it's certainly not something you can just go in and posture around, or rather, too many people do. But that's not what I believe it should be. So I've ended up having to take the job much more seriously than I had previously thought I would.
And can you give us a bit of an idea as to what the role of the Lords is in lawmaking? I know you probably can't describe a typical week because they're probably all very different, but what are the kind of things that you need to do to make law effective?
So a bill goes through a variety of stages at the House of Commons. And then, by the way, it's quite literally carried on a gold platter from the Commons down the corridor, and it then is delivered into the House of Lords. And then they announce that this bill has arrived at the House of Lords. And then there's a procedure that starts of debating the bill in the House of Lords. And the role of the House of Lords is to scrutinise what's been passed in the Commons and to amend it where it feels necessary to make it fit for purpose. Whereas things go through quite quickly in the House of Commons, sometimes bills can really get rushed through, and especially now that we have such a government with such a large majority. But that was also true of the previous Conservative Boris Johnson original government. Things could just get nodded through because it would be very hard to defeat it in the Commons. When it comes to the Lords, the idea is that even though there is a party structure, that there's also crossbenchers, there's people like me who are non-affiliated, and that we are given more time because it's the main role that we have. And we're not employed, by the way. We're not like MPs. We haven't got a job. We have jobs, and then voluntarily, with expenses, we then go in and scrutinise these bills. And so we get, in a way, a typical week is where you find out what bills are coming up in the next few weeks. And for somebody like me who's not in a party, I then have to choose which pieces of legislation I'm going to follow through. And after a second reading, which is where you have a general discussion on what your view is of the bill. So recently, I did my second reading speech on the Employment Rights Bill, and I'm a big person who supports workers' rights. So you think, oh, brilliant, no, this would be something I can support the government on. I'm not always looking to fight with them. Of course, then I read the bill, which is absolutely enormous. When I read the bill, I read a summary of the bill. The bill is ginormous, and it's grown substantially in the Commons because the government kept adding in amendments. So you do your general second reading, and then we go to a committee stage in which you put forward probing amendments, in which you try and test whether the government will accept some changes. And I will be putting in a number and put my name to a number of amendments at that stage, but there'll be hundreds of amendments. It'll take weeks. And then finally, it's report stage, at which time you put forward amendments that you could, or you threaten the government that you'll bring to a vote. And at that point, you then, unlike committee where you're scrutinising, going through line for line, putting in amendments to see whether they'll change, a report, you're actually saying, no, we want you to amend this bill and you can make changes then. It then gets sent back after that process to the House of Commons, and the Commons can then either decide to accept the amendments of the Lords or not. And actually changes do happen. This is where it's a bit anti-democratic. Often the government of the day, because they don't want a kerfuffle, accept Lords amendments and do a version of that Lords amendment in the Lords, and change the original bill, and nobody in the Commons even notices that's happening. So there are changes that are brought to effect by the Lords. I personally think that's wrong, because I think that this should be all democratically accountable to the British voters. And if it happens at the Lords, they're not. But anyway, that's more or less what happens. So the role is to scrutinise, sometimes just to create debate, because you're raising issues like my second reading speech of the Employment Rights Bill, and I won't go on any further than this, was to say, but are the trade unions fit for purpose at the moment? You know, they're selling out the Darlington nurses. They threw Kathleen Stock under the bus in relation to UCU. You know, where's Unison when you're a health worker who's been done over for a freedom of speech breach, for example? They're nowhere to be seen. I also said that the reason we had a free speech union was precisely because of a negligence in that direction. The thing that's really funny, and I said, anyone on the Labour benches were up in high dudgeon at my comments, right? They didn't like it at all. But then I realised, oh my God, 3 of them are general
TUC,
directors
general
of the
secretaries.
TUC.
Yeah.
Then you've got, the two former heads of the National Education Union, a couple of UCU leaders. You think, Unite heads, all these, and you think, oh my God, the bureaucrats are right. Yeah. So they like to pretend they represent the workers, right? And some of them formally do or did, but actually they're the leading lights of the trade union bureaucracy, which more often than not will have sold out their own members in a variety of ways, even though some of them will have done very well at representing their members. So it's a funny old place, because you're not bumping into rank and file workers when you're having these debates. Let's put it that way.
So I've got a question, and this is just making the most of having you here, because this is something that I cannot understand, and I've looked online to try and figure it out. What is the difference between a non-affiliated member of the House of Lords and a crossbencher?
It's actually a good question. It was assumed that when I went in, or I assumed that I'd be a crossbencher. It has to be said that although I was offered the peerage by the number 10 under Boris Johnson, they were under no illusions that I was going to ever sign up to be a Conservative. So that was never happening. And myself and Kate Hoey and Gisela Stewart, who were kind of considered to be kind of vaguely on the left Brexiteers, they wanted to kind of acknowledge the red wall voters of the 2016-2019 period. And so I think we all thought we'd just join the crossbench. But because we'd all been in different parties, there was a period where we had to kind of not be in anything, because crossbench, you can only join straight away if you've not been in a political party. And Kate and Gisela had been in the Labour Party, and I had this bit of a Brexit Party moment. During the months, I think there's a 6-month gap, the crossbench actually then have to invite you to join them. I think it didn't take 6 months. It took about 6 minutes or 6 days before the crossbench realised that they might not be inviting me at all. But also the crossbench, which is traditionally just people who are not affiliated to a party, have become a bit like a bloc. They don't have a whip system, but they are the great and the good. It's where all the law lords are. It's where all the kind of the former heads of charities also. And to be honest with you, Kay Hoey and I in particular just looked at each other and thought, we're not going to feel at home there. We don't like it.
So they're what we might call the liberal elite.
Yes. God, can you imagine? It's like, and they really are. And the head of the crossbenches kind of had a word with me, and he sort of, which we both mutually agreed this wasn't really a plan. Let's put it that way. Okay. They don't want people like me. And so non-affiliated are just simply people who are not in the crossbench, but not in a party. And actually, there's people like Ian Austin, who was left the Labour Party over anti-Semitism. There's all sorts of... there are people who've been kicked out of parties for doing something discreditable. And so it's a bit of an odds and sods. But we now actually do all kind of sort of form a bit of a group. And by the way, the Greens, there's 2 Green peers, they're non-affiliated. There's 2 Plaid Cymru peers, they're non-affiliated. So there is kind of a group of us.
So just going back to the idea of the Lords as a scrutinising chamber, and it feels a bit inefficient. So the way you might imagine that you would develop law is that the government would have a draft, take a lot of advice, come up with a draft that works, and then send that to the Lords. And it sounds from what you've said that a lot of that kind of preliminary work isn't done. I have to say, my experience of looking at pensions legislation, which admittedly is a very technical area, is that often first drafts of bills are really quite poor. Why is that? Why is it that we don't seem to have those kind of skills at good drafting?
Well, I think there's two things to be said about it. I mean, don't want to sound like a stuck record, but I do think that all those many years in the European Parliament did not help develop the skills of a civil service who know how to draft laws. I mean, if you actually talk to any organisation, they tell you that effectively they always had EU officers. All their legal framework was developed in the European Union. And what they had was they employed staff to interpret EU law and how it would apply to the UK. I mean, huge amount of lawmaking, in other words, happened elsewhere. It didn't happen in the UK at all. It might then have been adapted. And so if you don't practice a skill, you lose it, don't you? So I think we lost the skill of drafting laws. That's the first thing. And we certainly lost the skill of being accountable for those laws, because they then became unscrutinized laws very often, because they were just drafted into UK or kind of shoehorned in a way. And so the process of even scrutinizing was left, I suppose, went a bit sort of flabby. I think that the other thing, though, is that there is this laziness that's emerged around having a second chamber of unelected peers. Because what has happened is that the Commons, the elected accountable chamber, just kind of uses the law almost as a virtue signaling device. We'll kind of get a law out. Oh, we need a law on, we've got to clamp down on knife crime. So we'll ban Amazon selling knives. So we'll kind of whip up a quick law. It'll get the headlines. Nobody reads it too carefully. And then it kind of will trundle its way through before it becomes law and end up as law. And that's a very limited law. But I've just spent too many hours of my life dealing with what's known as Martin's Law, which is about the terrorism and premises bill, which is now an act, actually, which was in response to the Manchester Arena bombing. Of all the things that they've made a law on, they did it on how we can get every premises in the country to have better security, as though the problem with the Manchester Arena bomb was the security, when of course the problem is that we have this absolute plague of radicalized Islamist people who are prepared to go and bomb a concert, right? And they sort of took the most, but they wanted a headline. And the mother of one of the victims of the Manchester Arena, a lad called Martin, who was killed, the mother wanted something in his memory. She campaigned for this law. Governments, Tories and then Labour want a headline saying they're doing everything to fight terrorism. They think about victims and then they develop a law. It's a really badly worded law. It's like, by the way, it's going to have a terrible impact on all sorts of premises, and they've got bureaucratic regulatory nonsense to get through, and not a person will be kept safe. But the minister kept saying, this law will save lives. So the reason I'm saying that is because these laws are drafted very often for all the wrong kind of box-ticking reasons to keep the public happy. And then they just think, oh, if it's badly worded, it's all right, the Lords will sort it out. And that then lets the drafters of the law and the elected politicians off the hook. So I agree with you, Hilary. The best laws have had quite a lot of time and energy gone into making them brilliant before they arrive at the Lords. And the idea should be that the Lords are simply reading them to say, have you thought of the unintended consequence of this? Have you thought of this? The only final thing to say is that because of that situation, it's allowed the Lords to be come like an opposition party to the elected Commons. So very often, and most recently, notoriously, was the Rwanda legislation. I was never a fan of the Rwanda legislation, but at least did understand the intent behind it, the Tories' intent. Again, it was badly drafted, by the way, piece of legislation. But the Lords didn't just criticise or scrutinise that bill from the point of view of its badly drafted nature and unintended consequences, but actually, as a bloc, largely opposed it politically because they do not understand what the fuss is about in relation to people turning up on the small boats. They don't understand the popular concerns about the borders not being protected. They don't sympathise with those people who worry about people arriving without their papers, the security implications, let alone all of the other issues around migration that we're familiar with. They didn't understand that because, as far as they were concerned, in their heads, because they're the House of Lords and the great and the good, we welcome all asylum seekers and migrants. And there's loads and loads and loads of lawyers in the House of Lords. So you get bored of them standing up citing, human rights law, citing the Convention on Asylum and so on. They know every single international piece of legislative break that could be used on a UK lawmaking process, and they deploy that to stop even the elected Commons doing what it should be doing.
I heard somebody use the phrase that the barristocracy the other day.
Oh, very good.
It's good, isn't it? Yeah.
So my image of Parliament is that in the House of Commons, you've got MPs that, like at the committee stage, they sit on their phones, they sort of sit up every now and again to raise their hand to make a contribution, but aren't really properly engaged in the legislative process, and they're a bit too concerned about headlines and what the whips think and so forth. And so I see the Lords as a bit of a refreshing slant on that. Is that I imagine, and I might be wrong on this, but I imagine that the House of Lords, it's populated by people that are making an effort to really scrutinise the legislation and picking up the pieces when the House of Commons is kind of neglecting their duty. Is there any truth in that?
There's a tiny bit of truth in it, but it's very, very much the way the Lords self-flatter themselves. And what I want to say to you is that if there is a weakness in the Commons, we should be addressing the Commons' weakness, not compensating for it with the Lords. But it's also the case that particularly in the, I'm told in the last 10 years, really Brexit kind of almost broke the Lords in a way, that this sort of notion that the Lords, even though there are party members from all the main parties, that somehow they kind of go beyond their party loyalties. And the argument is, oh, well, they don't have to ever get elected because they're there for life. And therefore, they're free to be non-partisan. And therefore, they're like these sort of expert, and there's loads of experts. And so I think we've got to be very careful. I mean, it's anti-democratic for a start off. It's also just not true. I mean, there's as much tribalism in the Lords now as there ever was. But Brexit really brought out a very nasty side. So anyone who was a Brexiteer in the Lords really was under a lot of, they had a tough time. Remember, most of the Conservatives in the House of Lords at that time were absolute Remainiacs, right? Because they were put in the House of Lords by David Cameron, right? Or then another group put in there by Theresa May. Or they were the kind of One Nation Tories who had always loved the EU beforehand anyway. So it wasn't even a party thing. That was one thing. Now what's happening, for your information, was that Labour are stuffing the House of Lords. And I mean literally stuffing the House of Lords because they feel that the Tories have had the advantage in the House of Lords numerically, and they're putting people in. And loads of the people that they're giving peerages to are ex-MPs. That strikes me as being even more anti-democratic.
Yeah.
I mean, it's anti-democratic. I'm there. I mean, what am I doing there? But can you imagine? So you go to the electorate, they don't vote for you.
Yeah.
They make a decision. I'm not voting for you. But it doesn't matter because you're going to be in the House of Lords being a legislator up the corridor next week.
Yeah.
That seems to be absolutely scandalous. So I think when you say the MPs are all on their phones and checking their messages, I mean, I don't know that that's fair of a lot of MPs, by the way. It's true of some, it's not true of others. But the process in the Commons is such that time is not given to scrutinise bills. Very often, committee stage is very short. We've noted one long committee stage recently, which is around the assisted dying bill, where the committee has kind of been stuffed with people. In the Lords, they have a different procedure, which is maybe a bit more open, but should be like this in the Commons, in my view, which is if you speak at second reading, you're automatically entitled to carry the bill through in relation to the committee stage and the report stage. So we all get fair time, if you see what I mean. And I think that that is a better system, but it should be applied to the Commons rather than it's kept for the Lords.
Well, I think that's a great potential solution to this problem.
Part of the solution,
were you
yeah.
Gonna say that?
Yes, yeah.
I know you're angling to move on to the solution, aren't you?
Yes, I kind of feel it's about time, because what we tend to find, Claire, with a lot of other podcasts is you listen to them and there's a lot of moaning and there's very little solution. So we do try to make sure that in all our interviews we do try to gather some kind of input on the idea of what are some of the solutions here. So I guess if you had a magic wand and you could change the way in which law is made and developed, you've given us some suggestions already, but what might you do? I mean, would you abolish the House of Lords tomorrow if you could?
I would abolish the House of Lords, but you couldn't, if you abolished it overnight, it'd probably be chaos. So
yes,
just to bear that in mind. Some of the solutions, things that I haven't discussed, I do think there's a problem in Whitehall and in Westminster with a politicised civil service. And as a consequence, the laws are written by and the guidance that is associated with laws and all of the paraphernalia around the laws is created by people who are behind the scenes. Very often, government ministers and then opposition shadow ministers barely have time to assimilate or, all of what is in a piece of legal legislation. So they're reading notes provided to them by civil servants. And their interpretation of the law is one where they are not starting from scratch and going through it. And so I think that there's a real problem there that needs to be addressed. And I think I would strip back the politicisation of the civil servants. I think there's probably too many civil servants, but I think that's one very dangerous aspect of lawmaking. I would absolutely abolish Henry VIII powers. And these are powers that are given in bills where you basically are asked as legislators to hand over all of the power to the executive. They basically give you a heading and they say, don't worry, we'll fill this bit in after we pass the law.
Is this like
Right, so
statutory instruments?
They're like statutory instruments. It's the creation of statutory instruments. Henry VIII powers gives the Secretary of State direct powers to make decisions. In the Employment Rights Bill, which is already, as I've indicated, enormous. I think it's, I can't remember, but it's something, it's enormous. Pages and pages, like a book, right? It has also got some, I think, 16 Henry VIII powers. That is very dangerous. That means that you are passing law that you actually will never be scrutinised in the public arena. And then they come back as statutory instruments to you where you're allowed to have a little vote. You don't even have a vote. You're allowed to have a little debate on it. And you can't, it's not the same. So get rid of them.
Just to be clear, so the bill might say something like, the Secretary of State shall determine how X or Y will work in the future. And then that power of that Secretary of State is exercised through the statutory instrument being passed in the Commons.
No, the statutory instrument will be passed, but it won't even be passed. The statutory instrument will be introduced later on.
Okay.
It's also the case, so they're called skeleton bills, or sometimes Christmas tree bills that you can keep hanging things off them, or skeletons are not enough flesh. The Employment Rights Bill, as somebody said, it's both got the two disadvantages, both skeleton but very fat, and also gives all of these powers for another time. And sometimes it can be things like where they'll say, at the moment, you're passing a bill that says, for example, this, Terrorism Premises Act, the regulation only applies for buildings that are 200 or more, 200 people or more. But you've given a power to the Secretary of State to change that, amend it in the future if the Secretary of State thinks that's appropriate. The other thing I would do is I would make every bit of guidance associated with a bill have to come back to Parliament for a proper debate. Because and at the moment, I think sometimes that happens like in some mad committee room, but nobody knows it's going on. It's like they sneak it through. Guidance is often the worst thing that can ever happen to you, because guidance gets sent to institutions. So at the moment, for example, and this isn't even a law, but it's coming out of Parliament, the government has set up a body to recommend the definition for Islamophobia, which you might not call Islamophobia, it might call anti-Muslim hatred. What could go wrong? Everything, right? I mean, it's not a piece of law. It's going to be written up as a piece of guidance. That will get sent out to every single institution. So you're sitting there as a university administrator and HR, you're not thinking about all this stuff, and you get a piece of guidance off the government. You don't think it's not a law. Think about what it was like under lockdown when you get the difference between law and guidance and nobody ever knew. And you then think, oh my God, we've got to do things now. So they think, oh, we've never celebrated Eid. We better celebrate Eid all the time. We haven't counted the number of anti-Muslim hate crimes or hate incidents there are on our university campus. Somebody might think that we're Islamophobic. And now we've got this guidance. We're going to have to now monitor everything and encourage and incite people to come and tell us if anybody looks at them when they're wearing a hijab in a wrong way, and then we'll know it's an incident. We don't want it, etc., etc. But these guidance things happen all the time. And I think that one of my solutions would be that guidance needs to be in the public domain, not just in Parliament, in the public domain, before it is introduced into institutions. And so that's another thing. So, as it were, cut back on the civil service and certainly get rid of politicisation. And my third thing is, very often you will hear governments tell you that they have consulted about a piece of legislation. So what they always say when I stand up and say I disagree with this, they say this bill has gone out for mass consultation, Baroness Fox of Buckley, and you are flouting the wishes of stakeholders and the public who have fed in. And the problem is that those consultations involve usually organisations that very often are quangos or NGOs or charities, often organisations that the government fund. And so when they're citing them, they're actually citing themselves, but 2 steps removed. So the other problem is that law is made in the name of the people, but the organisations that represent the people are often actually astroturfed almost. I mean, so I'm not trying to create a conspiracy theory, but a little bit like the adolescence controversy, the Netflix series, where the government calls a summit with a charity that we then find out has advised the writers of adolescence, and that charity tender has actually got money from the government and to work on radicalising young men and misogyny. And then they will come back to us and say, we have to do something to strengthen online safety even more than the terribly censorious acts that we have, because we've talked to Tender, a youth charity working for people, and they've told us that there's incels being created everywhere we look. And so we've got to clamp down. And when I object, they'll say, but they are a charity that works with young people and they've told us, blah, blah, blah. And it's like Kafkaesque. You're surrounded by bodies that do not represent the public at all. And they don't like it when I stand up and try and say sometimes, if public opinion or when you talk to members of the public, and I feel a little bit folksy and and fake when I do it, because I'm trying to somehow give a voice to ordinary people in the halls of power in the House of Lords. But I also genuinely feel that I have as good a chance, I'm at least as legitimate for me to try and embody the fears, the anxieties, the worries, and the wishes of ordinary people as these people who hide behind their folk charities and their NGOs and so on, because I don't think that they have remotely got the feelings of the public in when they're speaking.
And that's why we're really pleased that you did eventually say yes to entering the House of Lords. So thank you for all that good work you do.
So
Thank you. Well, I try.
I've got one last question on this. Are there restrictions on what you can and can't do as a member of the House of Lords? Like, you can't vote in a general election, can you?
No, that's a big shocker. I mean, I was so shocked I discovered I couldn't vote. I was like almost like putting it back in. But,
And you can't be
anyway,
a part of you can't sign up to be a member of a political party.
I can't sign up.
You can't sign up to be a member of a political party.
No, you can. Yeah, I mean, most of them are. I mean,
But
it's
you
mainly
personally,
Labour
as a
party.
non-affiliated.
Yeah, well, then I'd just join whatever party group. I'm not going to, just in case anyone's thinking of asking
I thought
me.
that might be the reason that you're not an SDP member.
No, I'm not an SDP member because I don't agree with everything the SDP says, and I'm not a Reform member because I don't agree with everything Reform says. But I'm broadly a cheerleader for what the SDP is trying to do. I've spoken at SDP conferences, Reform conferences. I know you're not the same, by the way. I'm not suggesting that. But you are insurgent parties nonetheless. And although Reform gets all the attention, I know that the SDP is very serious about policy, and I've always admired that. And that is not something that could be argued in relation to Reform. I'm aware of that too. So I think that my job is to ensure that you aren't demonized, and that also people are aware of the fact that there is not a two-party system or even a three-party system, and that actually the hopes and aspirations of millions of people are going to be captured much more likely by the SDP in the future, or Reform, or whoever, than the Labour Party, the Tories, or the Lib Dems.
Thank you for that vote of confidence. Thank
that
you.
Endorsement, I think.
It's endorsement of your aspirations. I think that's fair. And you know, if you got me to be a member, I'd spend my whole time rowing with you over policies. That's not going to happen.
We do have quite a lot of internal debate on policy as well. So, shall we give Claire a little rest, and I will bring my item to Culture Club first.
Yes, I'm not actually sure what you're doing for Culture Club. Oh no, I am.
Yes.
Yes.
I want to talk about Crown Green Bowls. I have my first match of the season tomorrow for the Jubilee Ladies Club at my local park. And
is this like Northwest Premier Division? Or?
This is Cheshire League, actually.
Cheshire League.
Cheshire League,
okay.
Yes, yeah. Do you know how many people play Crown Green Bowls in the UK?
10,000.
About 269,000.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, loads and loads of people play. There are about 2,000 clubs, about 100,000 affiliated members of the leagues, and about 269,000 players. Average age 43. I did look up on British Bowls, which is younger than I thought.
43.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. Okay, that is surprising.
So there are quite a lot of young
so I could
players. You could absolutely, yes, exactly. The biggest chunk of members are actually the just retired, so the kind of 60 to 75 kind of people. A lot of those are women, although there's a lot of men as well. And it is, obviously it's a non-contact sport. It gets people out, it gets people down the local park, gets people involved in their communities. So hooray for all that. So that's all good stuff. There are a few challenges. So people might have seen in the news there's been quite a few local councils who are making cuts in funding, who are no longer supporting their Crown Green bowling greens in the parks. And obviously, once you stop upkeeping the greens, they often get vandalised. You can't really play on a green that's not been mowed and that's not been looked after. And so there's a bit of a crisis in terms of facilities. So there are some clubs that are now trying to take over their greens. So Connors Quay, you'll be familiar with, Claire, on Deeside.
Yeah.
The club there has just taken over the green and taken over the upkeep from the council because council are no longer funding it. So I'm kind of prepared if ever that happens in our park, that we be ready to make sure that we don't let it fall into disrepair. I just wanted to kind of maybe encourage people to find their local Crown Green Bowling Club, go and have a go. It's very easy in terms of, you can have a go at it. You don't have to have massive skill to do it. But it is very difficult to win. I found that it's very much like cricket. You have to get the line and the length right. So, and obviously there's lots of complications. The woods, that's the bowls that you use, have a bias in them. So depending on how you hold them, they will go one way or the other way. All the greens have a crown. The crown isn't necessarily in the middle. So different greens have a crown in a different place.
What's a crown?
So that's the way that the green mood goes up and down.
Okay.
So it has kind of, it's small, but it's a small hump on the green. And that can be in any place. So you have to learn different greens. You have to learn to read the green. And so in terms of developing your skills, there's certainly a long way for me to go. But you can just enjoy it without being a professional on day one.
Okay. Well, we spoke with William Clouston on Take Me Home a few weeks back.
Yes.
And we mooted the idea of a Lido in every village and every town.
We did.
So maybe the SDP Britain will have a Crown Green Bowls green.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And a Lido in every town in the country.
Yes. I did hear from a friend who speaks Italian. Don't you speak Italian?
I do, yeah.
That it is Lido.
Well, it is Lido if you're speaking Italian.
Okay.
But you have to anglicise words when you translate them. So I would say Lido.
Okay. Well, we'll continue that controversy.
Yeah.
The how you pronounce it. So Claire, did you have something to bring to Culture Club?
A couple of quick things. I've just finished reading a novel called Girl by Edna O'Brien, and I love Edna O'Brien. She's an Irish writer. This is quite a harrowing book. It's pretty difficult, but it's beautifully written. It's based on the kidnapping of schoolgirls by Boko Haram in Nigeria. If you remember those terrible stories.
Yes. And
it's the story of one of the schoolgirls who is kidnapped. She did a lot of research. Mariam is the central character. And I suppose it's on the one hand, the heartbreaking story of what's happened in countries where Islamist barbarism has taken a hold, the terrible attitude to young women, that we're familiar with, that parts of that radical Islamist outlook can engender, and things like that can happen in war, but then it's added to by this particularly backward attitude to women as just chattels, sex objects, and so on. And so it's really grim. I mean, people who say, watch adolescence to understand, you think, no, read Girl, Anyway, and of course, it's a reminder of things that happen around the world where you just kind of see them on the news, but you don't know the detail. And all it's a work of fiction. So just like Adolescence, I'm not trying to say it's a policy document. I'm just saying it gave me some insight as to what a young woman might go through in those circumstances. It's really, really brilliantly conceived of. And actually, she has a baby and she's forced to marry one of the Islamist fighters. And even though you, at this stage, hate all of that whole thing, you then realise that he's actually only signed up because they were threatening to kill his mother and to do the same to his mother. So the tragedy of it all is too much. That nice and cheerful, but it is brilliant. And I made a decision, by the way, because I spend so much time reading bloody laws, which is so boring, and policy stuff. And I also have to read a lot for my job at the Academy of Ideas, because when I'm thinking about the programme for the Bachelor of Ideas, which I hope every SDP member and supporter and voter comes to this year, October the 18th and 19th, but that's one side. I'm thinking all the time about contemporary worlds, and I made a decision that I was going to read more fiction, because I used to originally voraciously read fiction all the time. I didn't intend to read a book that was then going to remind me of the real world in quite such a vivid way, but there we go. And the other thing I just wanted to mention, because I'm a bit late to the table on this, but I think actually SDP people, you might all be watching it, which is the series Yellowstone. And Yellowstone is a series on Netflix. It's based in America, and it's about ranchers. And it's very, when you watch it, you'll understand, but it's very much like the importance of home and family and all the rest of it. It's an entirely romanticized version of the idea that the ranchers, the cowboys, are now the new Indians in the sense that they're the victims of progress and modernity trying to come down upon them. It's set in Montana, but it's such brilliant acting. And it's also very, we're all trying to understand what's happening in contemporary America. We're trying to understand the kind of people who might be supporters of Trump, and I'm sure SDP, certainly I think of flyover states and all the rest of it, and car workers or unemployed, but this is like the cowboy version, this kind of world that you never knew existed. Well worth a look. It's an absolute cult hit in America, and there's 5 seasons. We'll see, and I think there's spin-off seasons, and I'm on near the end of season 3. But Kevin Costner's the main character, the main rancher, and he is to die for in the way he embodies something of the American dream in a romance, like brutal, anti-progress, so everything I disagree with, because I'm very pro-progress. I'm also not into necessarily homegrown, everything should be grown by us and natural and all the rest of it. It drives me mad. That's not me at all. One reason I won't join the SDP. But nonetheless, I really got a lot of sympathy for that outlook by watching this series.
Sounds like an Oklahoma for the 2020s.
Yeah.
Great. Well, we'll put the details of that in the show notes. Thanks so much for joining us, Claire. It's been a fantastic episode, and I'm sure people will learn loads from it in terms of the Lords.
Can people already get tickets for the Battle of Ideas Festival?
Of course, and the early birds are out. And I know the SDP come and have a stall now every year, and I think actually recruit quite a few bits of interest. So I hope that we'll see you there again. I think this year, it's easy to say this year more than ever, but my God, trying to work out to understand what's happening in the world. We're in that period where, when you're like at school and you read the history books where it says pre-war, into war, or, everything changed. We know that we're the bit where everything is going to be completely different in 10 years' time.
Yeah.
But we don't know what it looks like yet.
Yes.
And we don't just want to be victims of it. I personally, I'm sure you at the SDP, want to shape it.
Yeah.
Because everything's in flux. It could go in any different direction. So now is our chance to be history makers. But in order to be history makers, you have to try and understand some of it. And so this year's Battle of Ideas, 100 panel debates, 400 speakers, and thousands of people talking is one of the best ways of trying to make sense of the world that we live in.
Yeah, we said this morning we are in the middle of a political revolution, which is
absolutely
exciting times to be in. So again, we will put the details of how to apply for the early bird tickets in the show notes. Thanks again for joining us, Claire. Please, as always, do like, subscribe and follow the show and recommend it to your friends. And we will see you again later in the week.
Thanks for listening.
Bye now.